Any case, this is just as well. It's fine.
Okay, great. Yeah, you're a musician. You know how the whole audio stuff goes.
Absolutely. So. Where's the roadies? That's what I always think. Where are the roadies?
You are the roadie. Okay.
I know. I'm falling down in the world, let me tell you.
Welcome to the Spoken Tome Media podcast series. You need to hear this. In this episode, Mark Jeftovic talks with Gary Lachman, author of Lost Knowledge of the Imagination.
Okay, right. I first came across Gary Lachman in my readings of Colin Wilson. I found a book that Colin Wilson had written the foreword for, which was called A Secret History of Consciousness, which was by Gary Lachman. When I looked at his catalog, I was hooked. He had biographies of people ranging from Rudolf Steiner to Emanuel Swedenborg, from Madame Blavatsky to Aleister Crowley, not to mention Beyond the Robot, which was his biography of Colin Wilson himself. In this vein, his other books include Caretakers of the Cosmos, The Secret Teachers of the Western World, and his latest, The Lost Knowledge of Imagination, which by the time you hear this podcast, we should have the audiobook up and available. His forthcoming work is called Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of Trump, which I'm also looking forward to. I have that one on pre-order. I have to add at this point, the more I learned about Mr. Lachman, I was delighted to find out that in his previous incarnation as Gary Valentine, he was a founding member and bassist for Blondie, an inductee into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and even played guitar for Iggy Pop. Those of you who know, my main day job is running Easy DNS, and our current slogan, Power and Freedom, is from the Iggy Pop song of that same title. So it's really great as a musician myself to have the opportunity to talk with Gary Lachman about the lost knowledge of imagination, and I would imagine among other things. So Gary, thanks for being on the podcast today.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, Mark. Thank you for having me on.
Great. Would it be accurate to consider you the intellectual heir to Colin Wilson?
Well, I guess you could say that. I think I pretty much tried to be that for a good part of my life, and then more or less, over the years writing these books. He's my mentor, or was my mentor. He passed away a few years ago. It was reading his book, The Occult, that got me going on all of this. And that was many years ago when I was Gary Valentine. I was first playing in Blondie. It was 1975. It was the spring of 75, I would say, around then, spring or summer. And I was living in this dilapidated loft space on the Bowery. And this was at the time when the big club, it was this little hole in the wall, but it was making a name for itself, CBGB, and people like Patti Smith and Television and the Ramones and Talking Heads and Blondie. We were all playing there, but this was before it was people became really famous and all that. And in this loft space I was living in, Debbie and Chris had a kind of kitschy interest in the cult, sort of bric-a-brac. So they had sort of pentagrams and upside down crosses and voodoo dolls and things like that. And we had pulled in a lot of really strange stuff off the street. There was a statue of a nun and other kind of weird sort of objet d'art. And another inhabitant of the building was this very wild, flamboyant artist who was a devotee of Crowley's tarot deck, the Thoth tarot deck, which at that time was still relatively rare. He did these big paintings based on the tarot cards, and then he did these impromptu readings. And it was through him that I started reading about Crowley and first getting into it, because I didn't have any real interest in the occult up until then. I mean, aside from sort of horror fiction, H.P. Lovecraft or old 40s monster films. And then it was while I was getting interested in Crowley and all this kind of stuff that I came across Wilson's book, The Occult, which came out in 1971. And what really grabbed me about it was that it wasn't a book of spells or, ghost stories or that kind of thing. He looked at the occult in terms of this philosophy of consciousness that I later came to understand that he had been working on for several years. But at that point, he had a lot of familiar names because I had read a lot of existentialism, and people like Hesse and Nietzsche, and then Jean-Paul Sartre and people like that, and so on. So these names were turning up in the book, and I was really surprised about that. And basically, he looked at it in terms of kind of altered states of consciousness, or higher consciousness, or more intense intensity of consciousness, and that just really grabbed me. And it was from then that I just started reading everything I could, and I started writing about it in the early '90s, and doing so ever since.
Cool. It's funny. I remember how I came across the same book. Probably not exactly the same time as you. I was 8 in 1975, but maybe a few years later. When I was around 10 or 11, I think I was home from school sick, and I was just flipping through daytime television, and there were these televangelists on TV, and they were going completely ballistic and hysterical about what they called the Auk cult. And they kept pronouncing it wrong, and they kept the Auk cult, that it's gonna be the end of us all, and someone think of the children. And I remembered that I had seen a book called The Occult on my parents' bookshelf upstairs in the living room. So the very next thing I did was I went upstairs and started reading that book, and it was Colin Wilson's Occult. And I'm reading it thinking, there's nothing, completely untoward about this. And that kind of brings me to my next point about both Colin Wilson's and your work, is that when you look at a book like The Occult, or a biography of Crowley or Wilson's chapters on him, we don't really find these bombastic claims of supernatural goings on. We don't actually see magic in the sense that we're seeing more of like an unclaimed or lost facet of human consciousness itself, which is not really supernatural. It's within nature. It's, I guess, what Colin Wilson called super consciousness in his later books. And so if you can talk a bit to the sort of, I don't even want to say mundaneness of this material, but not outside the realm of the natural.
Oh, no. I mean, well, if you take natural in the sense of what happens, or what do we experience, it's a phenomena. I mean, when I say it, I'm talking about a variety of different forms of what we would call paranormal or supernatural. I mean, there's different sorts of things too. There's sort of paranormal experiences, or psychic experiences, and then there's sort of the more mystical ones, which have a different kind of context. And I mean, they're all part of gradient. I think this is one of the things that Wilson worked out. But no, because the thing is, he starts from our everyday consciousness. I mean, his very first book was called The Outsider. Mm-hmm. And this came out in 1956 when he was a very young man. He was 24 years old when it came out. And it made his name. He was famous overnight. And he had been teaching himself how to write, and sort of hitting the high road, both in England and in Europe, in France, and he spent a great deal of time. So once he had sort of left high school, or the equivalent in England, and going from job to job, sort of doing sort of short laboring jobs, or never staying in the same place for too long, and sleeping rough and all this kind of thing, because he had this obscure sense of what I was saying before about this feeling that consciousness should be able to achieve a kind of intensity that he experienced intermittently, on its own, and that sometimes we can experience, say, under the influence of some substances. So for Wilson, it was mostly alcohol, but he was also very aware of the sort of banal, the emptiness, the mundanity, sort of the pointlessness of most life around him. I mean, again, he was coming of age in sort of post-war England. It wasn't a poor family, but he was certainly working class background, and his father had to work all the time to just about support the family and all that. But he became fascinated with these characters from the 19th century, early 20th century, different poets and philosophers and writers and artists who somehow felt outside of society. And he didn't mean just sort of the dropouts and the misfits and the, what in his time would have been the beatniks. In his own generation, it was called the Angry Young Men. But not so much people that don't fit in because of some quirky eccentricity, but it's because they have this craving for this more intensity of being, this kind of intensity of purpose. And Wilson felt that himself. And his whole body of work, which is well over 100 books and well over half a century of time devoted to it, was about what he called trying to understand the paradoxical nature of freedom. And this is this strange phenomenon we're all subject to, where freedom, if you take it in its broadest sense, is something we know very, very well exactly what it is whenever it's threatened. If someone wants to take it away from us, we know full well what it is, and we have no ambiguity about it. And its value is palpable and direct and unmistakable. And we'll fight. We'll do anything we can to have it, to keep it, or get it back, and so on. But the strange thing happens is once we overcome the obstacle to it, once we've managed to solve the crisis, as it were, we somehow lose our grasp on that intensity, and suddenly the freedom becomes a burden. It becomes something that we don't know what to do with. This is one of the things that's sort of the central theme of many, many different existential kind of writings, where you have the character sort of, drifting through whatever, Paris or somewhere else, and, confronting everyday things and sort of not knowing what to do, where to go, and constantly feeling like he has to decide about, his own purpose in the world. And there's a kind of emptiness that hovers over him. And Wilson felt that, and he understood that. But at the same time, he also understood this other state where suddenly this kind of sudden, very vivid, powerful grasp on the reality of freedom, the reality of the values that give your life meaning and purpose. They suddenly burn with this great fire, and he relates a variety of different characters in The Outsider and subsequent books in which this sort of thing happens to. Nietzsche, William Blake, people of that sort. Pascal, the 17th century religious thinker, and so on. And he, although he didn't really write about the occult until the late 60s, when there was a cult revival that started in the early 1960s, and by the mid 60s, the people like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were really into it, and publishers were asking writers to, if they would want to write books about it. And Wilson accepted that commission to write the occult. Basically, he says, because he needed the money. I mean, he sort of started out kind of being slightly skeptical, tongue-in-cheek. He'd always had a slight interest in it, but it wasn't as important to him as, say, philosophy or literature or things of that sort. But he could see how this pursuit of what he came to call peak experiences, and the sort of intensity of consciousness, you said superconsciousness, he could see how that related to a variety of different sort of phenomena and experiences that are sort of associated with the occult. And that's what he does in that book. And so it isn't, I would say, yes, it isn't supernatural in the sense that there's a kind of a complete break between this world we're in and, powers or forces or beings from some other realm kind of come in. But it's an extension of the world that we're in now. And that is there all the time, but it's our own consciousness that keeps us sort of unaware of it. And basically for Wilson, it's a question of a kind of energy. It's a question of a kind of vital energy that crisis somehow releases in us. Our unconscious recognizes that, whatever it is, it's important. And we get this kind of sudden burst of energy, and we're often able to do remarkable things. There's a wonderful essay by the American philosopher and psychologist William James that Wilson always refers to, called The Energies of Men. And James, in that essay, he was exploring the phenomena of second wind, when athletes or runners, when they feel they've completely lost it and they have to stop, and if they don't stop now, they're going to, drop down dead. And suddenly, at the last second, this other thing kicks in, and they're suddenly, fresh as a daisy and can go on for another 20 miles. And so James was looking into that phenomenon. And we know William James also, he was a great experimenter with consciousness. He experimented with nitrous oxide and peyote and other things, and investigated sort of psychic phenomena and so on and so on. But Wilson came to see that when that kind of power is, available to us, this kind of depressing, pessimistic, negative, empty vision of much of existentialism is kind of blown away, and we have this sort of mystical experience. When William Blake talks about seeing heaven in a grain of sand, and so on. And this is the sort of thing that he pursued. In his early stage, he wrote books of philosophy. After The Outsider, there's a cycle of books called the Outsider Cycle that are about six books that explore these ideas in literature and psychology and science and history and so on and so on. And then by the 70s, he was writing about the occult and the mystical and magic and so on. And that's pretty what he wrote about, for the rest of his career. But it started, it was like a very long road for him. And that's one of the great things about reading him, is that you get an education just by reading him. Because if you follow up all the leads that he starts, and that's what I did, and basically I started reading all the people that he was referring to, you get a sort of what used to be called a liberal arts education.
Well, I blame both Colin Wilson and you for an out-of-control Amazon binge habit, because as I read through your books, I sort of make my annotations in the margins and underline stuff, and I pretty well just put almost every book that you mention into my shopping cart as you mention them. And then I kind of pare it down a bit and buy it, but I always have a steady stream of packages coming to the office here. But turning to your book, it's okay, The Lost Knowledge of Imagination, if there's a theme in it, I have it here in my notes, and I don't know if it's a quote or something you said in a previous podcast I listened to, but the polarity between inner and outer world that we experience today was not always the case.
Yes. Well, that's one of the themes of the book, that the sort of sharp differentiation between what we call our inner world, what's inside my head, my thoughts, feelings, memories, visions, and so on, and this outer world, the external world of physical things and nature and cars and man-made objects. At some point in our past, it's been suggested that this sharp separation wasn't quite as sharp as it is now, and that there was more of what we can call a participatory relationship between the two, or the two weren't two. They were maybe different sort of parts of a one, as it were. And the person who writes about this quite a bit was a fellow named Owen Barfield, who is probably best known, in many ways, sadly, as being the great friend of C.S. Lewis. And I say sadly, not because there's anything wrong with C.S. Lewis and being his friend, but because Barfield is, in his own right, his writing and ideas, deserve to be known for themselves. And but he was also a philosopher of language. And he wrote a book in the 1920s called History in English Words. And he came to the conclusion that if we sort of understand or look at the history of language, we can see there evidence for what he called an evolution of consciousness. And how he came to that conclusion was that he saw that when we go back to the earliest sort of evidence of language that we have, the earliest sort of texts, because obviously that's what we have. We don't have the oral that must have gone on for quite some time before then. But the earliest sort of evidence we have down to us, the language is very what we would call figurative. It's full of metaphors. It's a metaphorical language. It's sort of a poetical kind of language by our everyday standards, compared to the way we talk today, which is much more prosaic or mundane. And what Barfield came to see was that when he was writing this book, the theorists of language at the time, they were trying to account for this, because then, as now in many ways, the dominant sort of paradigm by which to understand something was evolutionary, but it was sort of Darwinian evolution. And in the simplest sense, that means you start with something, very simple, and then gradually over time it builds up into more complex kinds of forms. But the strange thing was that the language that you could find at the very earliest evidence of it, it was already something that was complex in the sense that it was very rich and figurative and imaginative. It wasn't simple, like our own language is in many ways today. We have more of a literal kind of way of understanding language. And the earlier language seemed more poetic. And if you're going to take the Darwinian paradigm as the best way to understand things, well, that's completely reversed. It should be the other way around. There should be a very literal kind of beginning, and gradually over time it gets more, built up and florid and rich and so on. And the only way that the sort of language theorists at the time could account for this is they said, well, it must have started in this very simple kind of way. And this is what Barfield called sort of the bow wow school of language, meaning that, at sometime in the eons past, Ugg and a few of the cavemen got together, and one of them said ugh, ugh, and pointed to something, and the other ones finally got it. When he said ugh, ugh, it meant that rock or something, or whatever, pointed something else, or some way in which you imitated sounds in nature, so you imitated a bird and something like that. And that really must have been the beginning. And then at some point, there was a whole generation of kind of like prehistoric poets, let's say, who started working on the language, and then they, for some strange reason we can't understand, they were incredibly creative, and they fashioned this rich, metaphoric, figurative language that we come upon. And Barfield said, well, that's fine, that fits in with your Darwinian paradigm, but that certainly isn't the story that language itself tells us. And he suggested that, well, instead of thinking that these people here's the thing I left out. One of the big parts of this is that these language theorists at the time Barfield was writing, they assumed that the world that we saw, forget about all the man-made things, but the natural world, so just, clouds and rivers and the sun and mountains and so on, trees and plants, we see them in the same way that the early man saw them. That nature is exactly the same in both situations. We just know more about it. And Barfield's saying, well, actually, no. What if the world was much more figurative back then? What if the world was much more poetic? What if the world was much more metaphorical, meaning alive? This is the sense that, what poetry does. It makes things come alive. It makes it more animated. And again, we know about how primitive man and indigenous peoples today, they have a sense that the world around them is animated, and we talk about animism and so on and so on. And we're, the standard interpretation is that, well, that's something that they project into the world. They project this kind of presence into the world. It's not really there. The animation isn't really there in the river and in the rock and all that kind of thing. It's something they project. Barfield wants to say, no, well, language seems to be saying, well, actually, no. They talked like that then because the world was like that. The world was much more living. And there was less of this rigid barrier between what is inside my head and what is out there. It flowed more. There was much more of a kind of interchange between what now seems to be two completely separate sorts of things. And so from that, with that background, Barfield came to understand that when he read poetry today, the reason poetry had this effect on him, because he loved poetry, and he read the Romantic poets that people like Shelley and Keats and Blake and others from that time, and they sing about this kind of living world. They sing about this kind of animated world out there, and they feel a connection between their own soul, their own inner being, and the phenomena out in the world and things of that sort. And what Barfield is saying is that poetry has that effect because it somehow induces, it somehow revives that sort of participatory consciousness that was the way humans experienced the world at an early time. And so he said, well, if it's the case that we evolved from that kind of more figurative deeper participatory way of being in the world to our more sort of prosaic, literal one, that is a sort of historical process. We arrived at the way we see the world. It's the end product of a long historical process. But that doesn't mean that this is the end in the sense of there's no further development. What Barfield felt we could do, and again, this is what he was saying poetry induces, is a kind of participatory consciousness while retaining our own kind of individual egos who can know. I mean, when in the olden days, human beings participated with the world, but they didn't know they were doing that. They just accepted it. It was just like animals do today. Animals are embedded in the world. And animals can't say no to the world, even when they're in pain or suffering. They have no way of detaching themselves and stepping back from it. But we can do that. We used not to be able to do that, Barfield is saying. But now we can, our modern way of seeing the thing. And that was absolutely necessary because we needed to develop self-consciousness and we needed to develop the ego. We needed to develop sort of rational knowledge and all that. But now we need to carry that further and regain this earlier sort of participatory kind of experience. And that's one of the things that the lost knowledge of the imagination is about. And that's fundamentally a way of getting inside things. This imaginative way of knowing, one of his aspects is that you know the insides of things rather than just the surface of them, which is what our rational sort of literal consciousness deals with. So that was one aspect of it, yeah.
Right. And I think, and I was looking for this book before today because I wanted to look at my notes at it and I couldn't find it, but the Atlantis Blueprint that Wilson co-wrote with Rand Flemath.
Yes,
where he spoke about the same thing, I think, that language was very they thought and even communicated pictographically, and then somehow that kind of, he called it a devolution, I think, into prosaic language that we have today.
Yeah, I mean, it's the very same thing. I mean, I don't know if it's that book, but I know in an earlier book, the sort of Wilson's books on sort of ancient civilizations, from Atlantis to the Sphinx. He was the first one he wrote.
Maybe
he talks about
it, yeah. Sorry,
he talks about this French Egyptologist named René Schwaller de Lubitsch, and he was sort of a maverick Egyptologist. The sort of mainstream, didn't take him particularly seriously, but he talked about the ancient Egyptians having what he called the intelligence of the heart. And again, this was a way in which you could understand the inside of things, and it was a way of it was sort of what we would call intuition, but in a more direct kind of manner, rather than just like a hunch, which is sort of how we feel it now, but something that would be more kind of fluid and more directed. And this was differentiated from what he called sort of the cerebral consciousness, which he uses this wonderful way of expressing it. It granulates experience, meaning that it turns it into little bits and pieces. And that, one of the exciting things for me in recent years, and I talk about it a bit in Lost Knowledge and in an earlier book called Secret Teachers of the Western World, is this wonderful book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, which reboots the whole left brain, right brain discussion, which had kind of gone dead for a while. But that's the difference between the right, put in the simplest way, the difference between the right and the left brain, how they perceive the world in different ways. One way is this kind of direct, intuitive, participatory way, which is sort of holistic and total, but it's rather fuzzy. It's soft. It isn't, kind of very sharp edged. And the other is the left brain. That's what it does. It granulates, as Schwaller de Lubitsch says. It turns a sharp focus onto this fuzziness, and it turns the HD on, and everything comes in this sharp crystal clarity. We're able to focus on individual things, take them out of the context, and we need both of these things. The right sort of global fuzzy consciousness presents a kind of field of experience, and without that, the left doesn't have anything to do. But then the left job is to go and kind of, okay, yes, I understand that goes there, that goes there, and ultimately the left is doing that because its job is to arrange the world, basically, and manipulate it. And for us, it's our sort of tool. It's our kind of survival tool, as you were. It's sort of utilitarian. It always looks at things in terms of what use, whereas the right just kind of presence is everything. It doesn't turn on the kind of is this useful or not. It's not interested in that. It's interested in it just sort of being, and that McGilchrist can talk about that. I'm giving a very quick summary of it. He can talk about that in terms of neuroscience and the different hemispheres and so on. But the sort of the kind of phenomenal experience that he's relating to the two hemispheres, that itself is described in, like you just said, that kind of what Barfield's talking about, the difference between sort of an older consciousness and our more modern one. Schwalder Lubitsch talking about the ancient Egyptians. Because Wilson's interest was, yes, okay, maybe there was this ancient civilization, but why should that be important for us today? It's interesting and all that, but how does it affect the price of tea in China, as it were? And what he came to is like, well, it seems that those people had a different kind of consciousness than ours, and that's certainly something we should be interested in, because what does that mean in terms of our own consciousness? Sort of esoterically, evolution, devolution is sort of depending on which way you want to look at it. Just basically, it was like that, now it's like this, I think people like Rudolf Steiner, who Barfield later became a kind of one of the most eloquent sort of interpreters of. He wrote quite a bit about Steiner's philosophy, and he fundamentally is talking about the same thing, although he builds this huge kind of system of esoteric history and cosmology on it and all that. But fundamentally, he says the same sort of thing, that in an earlier time, human consciousness was much more like the kind of consciousness we experience in dreams today, in the sense that it's fluid, it changes. There isn't the sort of hard edges to things that we have in sort of real consciousness. And as you say, it was pictorial. That's what you started with, and I didn't get around to, but that's precisely it too. It isn't linear. It's not verbal. It's not a logical. Things are related not logically. They're related sort of symbolically or qualitatively, and this is the pictorial kind of consciousness. And this is what Steiner said in ancient times. What he has these weird names for these things. He calls it our old moon consciousness, but it's a kind of a picture thinking, which is very much what our dreams are like. We don't think in logical sort of terms in dreams. We think of images and symbols and so on.
Right. And the idea that human consciousness itself evolves, I think, is new to most people. They think that we came out of the trees and we stood upright and we started using that opposable thumb. But the idea that the nature of consciousness itself evolves or has been evolving over time doesn't get a lot of consideration. And I think my first exposure to the concept was in, Gebser's book, The Ever-Present Origin. And you mentioned also in the last chapter of Lost Knowledge of the Imagination when Petrarch climbed Mount Ventoux, or however it's pronounced. You said he single-handedly invented the nature tourism industry. Gebser called that like an epochal event that signifies no less than the discovery of landscape and an awareness of space. And it basically anticipated perspective. And it, that set off a chain of events that took centuries to play out. But perspective itself then gave rise to the Renaissance and the rise of science. There's a Canadian here that I don't think very many people have heard of, named W.R. Clement, who wrote an entire book on this called Quantum Jump, on how perspective drove the Renaissance. But that then brings us to where you start Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, where in the early 17th century, we get the scientific method coming out of all this.
Yeah, no, it's yes, absolutely. I mean, it's yeah, if you look at the history of this, there's some fascinating sort of ironies in many ways, because the very science that would eventually sort of undermine the Hermetic aspect of the Renaissance. I mean, we know the Renaissance as being the rediscovery of classical learning of the Greeks, mostly Plato, and so on. But it was also a rediscovery of the ancient Hermetic writings, what's known as the Corpus Hermeticum. Mm-hmm. And there's a story I tell in other books when Marsilio Ficino, who was given the job of, he was a Greek scholar at the time, and you have to remember, this was like coming out of the Dark Ages, so a lot of books weren't available. Not everyone could read Greek, and translate it into, Latin, and so on. And he was given the job of translating all these Platonic texts that had been recently rediscovered, and he was getting to work on that. And then suddenly it was like, oh, no, stop the presses. Here's something that's more important than that. And you have to put aside Plato, and you have to translate these things. And what that was more important than Plato was these texts from the Corpus Hermeticum. And this is a body of mystical, magical, occult, spiritual writings that were attributed to the mythological sort of creator of magic and writing and thought and science, Hermes Trismegistos, thrice great is Hermes. And there's a wonderful book by Francis Yates, that Giordano Bruno in the Hermetic tradition, that tells us about how much the Renaissance was influenced by ideas that today, we consider occult, that New Age, and that kind of thing. They were taken very, very seriously then. But strangely, it was also out of this kind of new idea of what humanity was about, rather than kind of the sinful, wretched creature of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance was about sort of man standing on his own 2 feet, and again, the rise of humanism, and recognizing that human beings aren't too bad. We can actually do some wonderful things. We're actually pretty creative, and so on. And it was out of that sort of renewed kind of self-esteem or new vision of man's capabilities that science, as we know it, gradually came out. And strangely enough, it undermined its Hermetic roots in one of these strange historical ironies. But yes, but precisely what you're saying is when the Italian poet Petrarch climbed this mountain, that the thing, why it was a big deal was that nobody ever thought of climbing a mountain just to see the view. Obviously, people climbed over mountains. People had to, for whatever reason. But it wasn't. No one ever wanted to say, "Hey, I wonder what it looks like from there." There's different disagreements about this, and some scholars say, "Okay, well, that guy did or that guy did." In any case, it wasn't something that was considered a normal everyday activity, which we do today. I mean, that's why I say that Petrarch sort of invented the nature tourism business, because today, we go out of our way to get to places that back then, or even as early as, say, 100 or 200 years ago, people just avoided. The wilderness, all these kind of desolate places where people didn't go to, precisely because it wasn't civilized. Now we go out of our way to get there. And that had its roots with Petrarch's famous ascent of Mont Ventoux. I mean, he tells the story in a sort of short letter that he wrote, and he tells about one of the sort of a farmer or a herdsman who had heard that he was going to make this crazy attempt, and he's trying to dissuade him, "Don't go, please. You'll find nothing but madness and death and all this kind of thing." So there was a real kind of, this was aberrant behavior, and there was real fear. Why are you doing this? And you're tempting the gods and all that. And then he does, and then he just describes seeing this fantastic view, which many of us just take for granted now. But for him, it was, my God. And so this whole idea of space, and this is the Gebser, the German-Swiss philosopher Jean Gebser, who you say wrote this fantastic book, The Ever-Present Origin. He said this was the beginning of the space age in the true sense, because prior to that, medieval man the world for him was like a tapestry. It was sort of flat and two-dimensional. And even earlier, we can see like the Egyptians have that kind of sense too. There's a kind of, flat two-dimensional character to the paintings and all that sort of thing. And suddenly that kind of tapestry view of things is pierced. There's the tapestry's torn, and suddenly just space stretching out in all directions opens up. And Petrarch is terrified by this, but he's also completely, fascinated by it. And that's the beginning of perspective. You start the perspective painting comes in, not too long after that. It transforms the whole idea of how people see a landscape and how they represent it. It slowly, gradually gives rise to what we, the space age that we know, today with, sort of probes going out past the solar system out there. So this was, we kind of cut the umbilical cord. Man is now standing on his own 2 feet and is able to survey the world and master a great deal of it. But that comes at a price. That comes at the loss of that connection that we felt in an earlier time. If it was a tapestry for medieval man, he felt part of the tapestry. And he had a kind of, more intimate relationship with sort of the natural world around him. It had a personality. It had what we would call a soul. But with the rise of this new perspective, that starts to fade. And that's one of the things you can see in the paintings, whereas before objects were closer or farther away depending on their importance, their significance, what they stood for. Now it's just like, well, where are they actually? When I look out on this landscape, where are they? Okay, that church is here, that the tree is over there. It's not like, okay, the church is the most important thing, so that gets pride of place. That whole changed. And that's, the beginning of just looking at the world as this kind of space that we're in with objects in it, and they have relationships between each other that are just purely physical and mathematical eventually. But yeah, that's the beginning, and that was a real shift there, And one of the things I just touch on briefly, but I again in this other book, Secret Teachers of the Western World, I go into more detail about it. Is that at that same time there was a really vicious attack on the Hermetic philosophy. There was actually a sort of Catholic theologian named Marin Mersenne, who just really wrote reams and reams about how the whole Hermetic, animistic, magical view of the world was wasn't even wrong. It was pathological. There was something kind of actually sick about it. So there's a complete kind of change there, and we're feeling, this is 4 centuries later, and in many ways, I would say we're starting to experience the breakdown of that kind of view of things. It's starting to take itself apart.
You mean the radical militant reductionist view is starting to break down now?
What Gebser called the breakdown of the mental rational structure. And if you look at things like postmodernism, for one thing, which is the flavor of the month or has been for a while now, and the whole idea of alternative facts and post-truth and reality television, the differences between truth and truth and false, reality and unreality, things of that sort, fact and fiction, that are pretty much the mainstays of this rational, scientific, very linear, logical way of looking at things. They're starting to come apart. I mean, I don't mean in the sense that hardcore scientists are suddenly saying, "Oh, yeah, so you're right. After all, everything's conscious," and not so much that, but you can even see the kind of more intense efforts to maintain that kind of view as evidence of a kind of sense of its, shakiness now. I mean, I'm not making any predictions, but I just I have a sense of that's sort of what's happening now. And it may be, while that loosening is going on, we might be able to generate a new understanding about imagination.
It's interesting because that rigid, death grip on science and reductionism and is built on these pillars of scientists or people who helped build science that actually never let go of the imagination and the consciousness side of it themselves. Like you talk about Blaise Pascal a lot in Lost Knowledge. You talk about Einstein. And I just came across a book lately by a guy named John Chambers called The Metaphysical World of Isaac Newton. Now, here's the sacred cow of science. It turns out to be who have been studying alchemy and prophecy and other lost knowledge, and just nobody knew about it until now.
Well, Newton wrote more about alchemy than he did about gravity. And gravity is an occult force. If you say occult means not seen, well, I don't know who's ever seen gravity.
Right.
So I mean, and actually, at the time when he was accused of sort of basically trying to promote this idea of this kind of hidden, unseen force, this whole idea of action at a distance, which is what gravity is about. But at the time, many people said, well, this is just kind of like spirits or something like that. So no, it was the economist John Maynard Keynes here some years ago when there was an auction of Newton's papers, and he bought them. And when he was going through them, he discovered all this stuff that no one had looked at for however many years. Because he sort of had his early discoveries, and then he spent a great deal of time working on alchemical experiments, searching for the philosopher's stone, and also this sort of biblical chronology and biblical prophecy, sort of predicting future events based on sort of understanding sort of a secret reading of the Bible and all that. And no, it's one of those things that I mean today if you say that, people say, oh yeah, that's right. Well, these guys are wacky. I mean, they could be brilliant about something, but they can just be totally wrong about that. So no, you're absolutely right. I mean, of course, I certainly don't mean that every scientist or all the science is against this stuff. It's what you say. It's what I say in the book. It's scientism. It's this kind of dogmatic faith. It's really a faith more than anything else. I mean, it's the faith that everything in the world can be explained in terms of this particular methodology. So one doesn't want to say, no, you're wrong, the methodology doesn't work. It does work. It works in many, many ways. We wouldn't be able to be having this conversation if it didn't work. But there are certain aspects or areas of reality, I would say, that it's inadequate. It's not very good at trying to explain those. But I guess the idea is, well, if you start saying yes to one of those things, where do you stop? Where you take your finger out of the hole in the dike, and the whole thing is going to collapse. I guess that's the fear. But I think that's something we have to somehow. It's that fear in many ways. I think we need to, in some way, sort of get over or get through. Sort of pass through this kind of dark night of the soul, as it were.
Right. I mean, when you talk about postmodernism and the scientism, you call it, and the idea of post-truth and alt-facts, it brings to mind that phrase of who's that English documentary filmmaker who coined the phrase hypernormalization?
Adam Curtis.
Right, yes. And that's what it strikes me as, because you have you have people with a straight face saying, and they almost deliver it as a pronouncement, well, there's a very good chance we're living in a computer simulation. Well,
yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then you have someone like Richard Dawkins, and you say, well, if you have everything figured out, then tell me what consciousness is. And he kind of he teases it out on the edge of well, we haven't figured that out yet, but we'll probably figure it out by a year or two from now.
Yeah, yeah.
And
well, I mean, the whole thing that we're living in some kind of simulation. I mean, that's Plato who said that 2,000 plus years ago. I mean, that's nothing new. I mean, this is one of the things. I mean, I just want to say, okay, well, if that's the case, who do you want to tell that to? I mean, who it's just sort of it's kind of like solipsism. I mean, if it's true, you can't prove it to anybody. It's just, it's like, but, and, the whole Richard Dawkins things, that's what, Rupert Sheldrake, he calls this sort of promissory note that, this kind of scientism, when it can't offer actual proof of whatever it is it's asserting, it'll write you a promissory note, and it'll say, yes, well, this is valid. And when the proof comes in, you can cash this in, and we'll give you the proof. And it's no, I mean, there's remarkable resistance, and the other side of it too, I would say, in the occult, spiritual, New Age world, whatever you want to call that world. No, there's a lot of people that are very they're science phobic, or something. They don't want to know anything about it at all, and that's equally inadequate. And it the only thing it does, if anything, is it just gives the other the dogmatists, the scientific dogmatists, fodder. It just gives them material to say, see what I mean?
Yeah, it's that kind of New Age flakiness. I hate, I don't want to impinge on anyone's sensitivities. I mean, you say, when you're talking about imagination itself, we could also say that imagination is simply our ability to grasp reality, or in some strange way to create it, or at least collaborate in its creation. Now, to me, I think of a big book for me which was purely tactical, but I think it was the father of all self-help books, was Maxwell Maltz's Psycho-Cybernetics, right?
Right.
Now, I think too many people oversimplify that and distill it down, and you have law of attraction and The Secret, and if you wish it hard enough, it's going to happen, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the entire law of attraction can be boiled down to one sentence, which is your filters and your biases affect your outcomes, right?
Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, yeah, again, it's that law of attraction comes out of Swedenborg, by the way. You can add that onto your synchronicity. You mentioned. The thing is, well, this is one of the things with that kind of stuff, is that in one sense, yes, you're right, it's true, but not in the way that you think it is. You know? Yeah. Or it's also, as you say, the truth itself is greater than the purposes for which you want to use it. If somehow I am participating in the creation of the world that I'm inhabiting, which is what most of the spiritual teachings say anyway, in some way, that to think, okay, great, now, okay, in that case, I'll just think a lot and I'll get a new washing machine or something. You know what I mean? It's sort of like you're this deep insight is being somehow turned towards a rather trivial purpose, and there's nothing wrong with, in some way, the idea that I don't know, you can somehow use this knowledge to have a more fulfilled and prosperous life and all that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that per se, but then it becomes the total aim of your focus. Then I would say it's sort of creating an imbalance and all that. But I mean, one of the things I say in Lost Knowledge, and I also point out in Dark Star Rising, is like, well, to me, the clear evidence that in some way the mind and the world at some points kind of interact and penetrate is precisely synchronicities. And synchronicity is a name Carl Jung gave to this phenomenon of meaningful coincidence. When there's a coincidence, something inside your head and something out in the outside world, when there's no causal relation, the one didn't make the other happen, but they're related through meaning. They're related through some kind of significance, and we've all had them, and I've had them enough times, so I just accept they're a part of reality, and I can't explain them, and I have to say I've yet to be convinced by any kind of explanation involving quantum physics and all that sort of thing, but I'm as convinced of their reality as I am of anything else. And okay, so if that's the case, so there are times when this participation I've been talking about takes place, if only for a moment. I guess the next step is like, well, can you make it happen? Can you induce it? And people like Colin Wilson and others, they've noticed that in their own experience, if they've tended to be upbeat and kind of optimistic and forward-thinking and purposive and all that, it's not so much that they are trying to make a particular thing happen, but these kind of lucky little things, these kind of helpful synchronicities do take place. I mean, I know it myself when I'm working on a book. I often find myself picking up something at random, just whatever, to pass the time. And I find myself, oh, gee, this is interesting. I can use this. I mean, this is sort of what they call the angel of the library, where oftentimes, precisely the very thing you're looking for just turns up when you don't have to search for it at all. It's just it's right there. So I'm willing to accept, and there's a lot of literature about this, that in some way, again, this sharp separation between inner and outer is not quite as sharp as we usually accept it to be, and in some way it radiates out, and likewise the other thing, if you're sort of pessimistic, if you're very anxious, if you have this sounds horribly wishy-washy and new agey. If you're negative though and all that also has the effect around you and all that. You can sort of create accidents and little mini crises and all that sort of thing. So I mean there is something to it. It's exactly how can we understand it in some sort of articulate, explicit way, and also, where does that leave us with the ethics of it? I think there's sort of an ethics of imagination as well. And I in the end of the book, I talk about the responsibility of the imagination. This is something that Barfield talked about as well. Basically, he was saying, well, if it's true that consciousness evolves, and if it's true that the world that we perceive outside ourselves is somehow informed by our interior sort of world, then well, it stands to reason that the sorts of things that we focus on and concentrate on may very well, come to pass out in the outer world. And he wasn't a big fan of surrealism in modern art, and he kept he writes about how all these sort of weird pictures that the surrealists were making, and subsequent to that, I mean, I don't know what he would think today of Damien Hirst or stuff like that, but it's just the idea that these kind of images are being sort of entertained in the mind and by creative people with very powerful imaginations. And it's not only them, it's the other people around them who sort of pick it up. It's what Coleridge, the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who Barfield wrote a book about, called the Lethargy of Custom. Basically meaning, somebody does one thing and everybody else says, okay, I'll do that too. And so these kind of images, just the same way that Dawkins talks about memes, memes spread. So certain kind of ideas or styles or, visions or whatever, they get picked up and imitated by people around them. And Barfield was concerned that, the more this kind of dark, negative, what I guess we would call transgressive kind of imagination expanded, the world would turn into something looking like that. And so he was writing that bit about 50, 60 years ago. So I guess, it's up to you to decide if it. Well,
here we are. Trailer Park Boys and Honey Boo Boo.
So there you go. And one of the people I didn't mention at all tonight in this talk is the poet, Blake scholar, and essayist Kathleen Raine, and she's the one I got the phrase "the lost knowledge of the imagination" from, and she was a fantastic student and teacher of this kind of imaginative tradition, which she found in the great Romantic poets like Barfield, but also in Plato and also in the Neoplatonists and people like Swedenborg, but also in the Indian traditions and all that. It's basically this tradition of the mind, the inner world, actually sort of being the true seat of reality, mm-hmm. and not that the outer world is false, but it's a reflection of what is in the inside world. And she wrote a wonderful essay called "The Use of the Beautiful." Again, this was in the 1960s, but it's a very early, sort of warning signal about the way the world was going to become, in the sense of, what we see around us. And she said that this whole idea of the beautiful is just disappeared from our culture. We don't really understand it. We don't produce it. And art, again, she's writing in the 1960s, which used to be the agent of this, has become a kind of anti-beauty. It's sort of attacking it, sort of, and you have that starting with Duchamp or onto Warhol and so on and so on and so on. So you can say, how do you want to say this? There's not so much a conspiracy against the imagination, but the imagination has kind of run riot in a certain way that she and the other people I talk about in the book say is not the real answer to the strict reductionist scientific view, because the imagination needs a certain tradition. It needs a kind of discipline for its true, for it to be true imagination and not fantasy, not fancy, which is one of the distinctions Coleridge makes, which is a very important one. He said fantasy, it doesn't create anything new. It doesn't really create anything. What it does is it takes bits and pieces of what's already created and puts them together in strange ways. So a flying pig, is a kind of fantasy, a fancy, or a unicorn or whatever. Whereas true imagination, it's original, not in the sense that it's novel. It's that it reaches into the true origin, which is the real imagination, which is the font of everything in this teaching. It's the basic kind of source of reality. And so, the true artist working with the true imagination, and also the true mystic or the true esoteric student or the true occultist, all these worlds tend to kind of, sort of meet at the source, as it were. And there's the whole tradition. It's starting up again now, but in the 19th century, where magic and art, sort of were fellow travelers for a while, and nowadays it's starting up again with this whole idea about occulture, which is sort of culture that's got some occultism in it, or the occult that's got some, some occult cultural aspects of it. And I've done quite a few sort of conferences and spoken at quite a few exhibitions about that. Actually, I'm doing one about this next month in Spain.
You just wrote a foreword on a book by that same title.
There you go. That's Carl Abrahamson. I'll give him a plug. It's a very good book. Carl's a very good. He's a very good occulturist, and he's a good sort of networker and going around and reporting on all the latest developments.
I have it. I have not read it yet, but I'll get to it. So, Gary, I want to thank you for your time. I think this is a good place to wrap it up. One phrase, as we were talking about, imagination and, if it overshoots or not, or respecting it or using it wisely. I don't think Kenneth Wilber meant this specifically when he coined the phrase aperspectival madness, but it kind of seems to fit. And was it in this book you quoted someone who said, careful what you wish for because you're going to get it in middle age? Was that you?
That's the German poet and scientist Goethe.
Right. Yeah.
He said, careful what you wish for because you'll get it in middle age. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to thank you again for your time. And
well, it's been absolutely my pleasure.
Great.
And, let's do it again.
Okay. We'll do another audiobook. I'll be happy to do it. Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Mark.
Thank you. Take care.
My pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.